Donald, how you doing, man?
I'm very well. I'm very well. How are you?
I'm doing well, man. I was just checking out your Instagram, and you were just in Greece a little while ago.
Mhm.
It's a place that I would really love to go to, and I know you frequent often.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time in Greece over the past few years. Became a permanent resident there, actually. So I kind of divide my time between Greece and Canada.
Okay, nice. Man, so I mean, let's just jump into it. Would you call yourself a Stoic, a studier of the Stoics? What would you say?
Yeah, I
Which
sometimes
one?
people, I'd say, do you know, I don't think it really matters too much. Like, I'd call myself a Stoic. Like, it depends what you mean by that. Like, by that, I mean somebody that aspires to follow Stoic philosophy, because Stoicism teaches us, like, that we shouldn't ever think of ourselves as kind of having reached the goal. We should think of ourselves as being fallible and accept our flaws. So it emphasizes that we're all students. So I take that for granted. I think student of Stoicism is a little bit of a mouthful, but I think all Stoics are works in progress.
Yeah, aren't we all? Um, when you said how you define Stoicism,
Mhm.
how do you define Stoicism?
In terms of the actual philosophy itself, like we could say where it came historically. Let me preface that actually by
Hmm.
saying historically, just in case people aren't very familiar with it. Stoicism is a school of Greek philosophy that was founded in 301 BC at Athens, not by an Athenian, but by a foreign immigrant, by a Phoenician merchant. And the other thing I'd say about Stoicism is that it's very heavily influenced by the philosophy of Socrates, who died about a century earlier, before the Stoic school was founded. So that's all the history we need.
Okay.
In terms of the actual philosophy itself, what did the Stoics believe? Well, out of all of the different schools of philosophy in Athens that were influenced by Socrates, the Stoics were the ones that placed the most emphasis on philosophy as a way of life, and the most emphasis on philosophical psychotherapy. Now, another little aside, many people may think that psychotherapy is a modern invention, but they'd just be straight up wrong about that. Like, the ancient Greeks wrote entire books on psychotherapy. They call it therapia, like therapy of the psyche. So they straight up had an idea of psychotherapy that inspired modern cognitive psychotherapy. And I'm also a cognitive behavioural psychotherapist by profession, so that's part of the reason that I'm interested in the subject. Now, the central teaching of Stoicism has a slogan that the goal of life is living in agreement with nature. And what they mean by that, it's slightly opaque. What they mean is that we should live in accord with reason. And they think of that as being synonymous with living honorably, wisely, and virtuously. So they think the rational life is the virtuous life in a sense. And that's really the cornerstone of Stoicism. And what's unique about that, or what's special about it, is that Stoics think that the goal of life is a kind of state of mind or a way of being, rather than external goods that we might attain. So the goal of life isn't to have a big pile of money. The goal of life isn't to be celebrated around the world as famous. The goal of life is to achieve an inner state of wisdom and moral integrity. And it follows from that, it has an important consequence. So the big important consequence of that ethic is that if you really believe that and you really try to live in accord with it, then you would be less upset than your average Joe if you lost your money or your reputation was damaged, because these things would be of less significance to you than the way that you dealt with the setbacks that you encounter. And so that's partly why Stoicism has always been associated with what psychologists today call psychological or emotional resilience.
What I would say that, you know, I've been on the Stoicism kick for 7 years. Okay. What I think most people would say Stoicism was this emotionless man.
Yeah.
Right. Like that's what we think of when we think of the Stoics,
That's
right?
what they
Like,
say.
yeah, that's right. But it's actually very opposite. You right. So how did these two, I mean,
Yeah.
how did the polar opposites get?
Wow.
Yeah.
People, I don't know if you've noticed this, right? But people say a lot of things that turn out not to be true. So even since the time of the Stoics.
Yo, hold on, but this was before the internet. Once the internet
Before
came,
the
it
internet.
broke the internet.
Yeah. On the internet, it's worse.
Right.
But before the internet, people also misunderstood the Stoics, even during their lifetime. There were people who famously misinterpreted them. And the Stoics repeatedly say that their goal isn't, as they put it, to have a heart of stone or of iron, or to be like a statue, or to be a man of stone. Those are the phrases that they use. Their goal of life isn't to be completely emotionless, but rather it's to replace unhealthy, irrational, pathological, excessive emotions with healthy, rational emotions, basically. And the part of that, the subtle part, but really I would say the most important psychological part of Stoicism, is that the Stoics adopted what we today call the cognitive theory of emotion. They inherited it from Socrates, and then they handed it on to the cognitive therapists today. And they really popularized this idea that emotions aren't just feelings, right? That emotions fundamentally also consist of beliefs and attitudes. So Albert Ellis, who was one of the pioneers of cognitive therapy, the clients that he saw in therapy, as all clients do, I'll tell you a little story about this that explains it quite neatly. Okay, so in therapy, clients will come and they'll sit in their first session, and then they'll tell you how depressed they are, or how anxious they are, or sometimes how angry they are. And then they'll tell you how it's ruining their life. It's destroying their relationships. It's affecting their health. It's giving them stomach ulcers or whatever. It's ruining their sleep. It's making life difficult for them at work. You know, it's sapping all the joy out of their life, etc., etc., etc. And then they'll reach a point where they've just listed a whole bunch of reasons why they should change. Right? They've given themselves a lot of motivation to do something about their depression or their anger or their anxiety. So they've told you how terrible it is. And then they'll usually kind of look slightly confused and scratch their head, and they'll say, I know it's awful and I know it's ruining my life, but I can't help it. It's just how I feel. And that's an expression of stuckness, as therapists like to say. And at that point, Ellis would lean forward, the pioneer of cognitive therapy, way back in the 1950s, 1960s. And Ellis would say, yes, but it's not just how you feel, is it? It's also how you think. And that's the essence of cognitive therapy. And the reason that's so important, we call it the cognitive revolution in psychotherapy, is because thoughts have propositional value. And by that I mean thoughts often are true or false. And we can evaluate the logic of them. We can evaluate how they correspond with evidence. We can compare them to alternative beliefs or thoughts and the emotions that might be associated with those. And it opens up a toolbox of cognitive therapy techniques that the Stoics knew about almost 2,500 years ago. So this is the beating psychological heart of Stoicism, is this idea that feelings aren't just feelings, they're also beliefs. For instance, the Stoics said that when someone is anxious, it's typically because they believe that something awful is about to happen and they won't be able to cope with it. Now, that happens to be very similar to the cognitive model of anxiety that we use today in cognitive psychotherapy. And so in many cases, somebody is anxious. There are some exceptions to this, but generally when people are anxious, it's because they fear that something terrible is going to happen and they won't be able to cope. But often they're wrong about that. So for instance, I'll give you a very specific example. People who suffer from panic disorder, not in all cases, but in a great many cases, fear that they are going to have a heart attack and die. So they feel a pain in their chest and the heart beats faster and faster because of anxiety and think, oh my God, I'm having a heart attack. And they'll often go to the hospital because
I've been here. This is me. I've been.
They think they're going to die,
yeah.
But they're wrong. They're not going to die, right? They're fine. They're not having a heart attack at all. They just feel really anxious. And as we put it sometimes today, there are a number of anxiety disorders or other psychological problems that consist in misinterpreting physical sensations. So when people have panic disorder, they tend to kind of misinterpret the physical sensations of anxiety and view them as the evidence for a catastrophic impending heart attack. The Stoics knew that. Now we can prove to somebody that they're not going to have a heart attack and die, and we can get them to question and reflect on their way of thinking. And when they change and correct those beliefs, after time, usually there's a kind of delay, it takes a bit of patience, but eventually their anxiety will significantly reduce. And the Stoics knew that as well. So this, I think, is really, the practical essence of Stoicism, the psychological essence of Stoicism is identifying the role that our thinking, and that's why Stoicism is a philosophical therapy, because it involves using the Socratic method, reflecting on and questioning the beliefs that causes emotional distress. So the opposite of that would be what we call lowercase Stoicism, where people mean just being unemotional. So someone who, or having a stiff upper lip, right? So
Having
we
a
say
what?
a stiff upper lip.
Okay, got it.
So when people say a stiff upper lip, what they mean is the idea that your lip would tremble when you're anxious. And someone with a stiff upper lip is kind of like trying to conceal their anxiety, right? They're
Yeah.
not showing it. They're keeping a kind of poker face, right? They try to keep their cool. But underneath, they may still actually be feeling anxious. Maybe they think they are going to die, like incorrectly, but they're not showing it. Now, that is not healthy. We know now, like, because that dude is just put a band-aid over his anxiety. He's just hiding it from others. He's just good at concealing it. Like the lowercase Stoic, he still has the beliefs that are making him scared. Like he's just kind of putting up a calm exterior, and hasn't really addressed the root problem, the underlying problem. So Stoics say, no, it's more important to find out what the underlying beliefs are that are causing his anxiety. And they actually think they can make a generalization about that. They think basically a lot of our anxieties and other problems are caused by putting too much value on things that aren't under our direct control and not enough value on things that are under our direct control. And that's the diagnosis that they make. And I think there's a lot of validity to that.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. I'm all in on this. So my next question is, this is a question my very religious friends bring up to me a lot. When you talked about morality right in the beginning. And they say, like a religious person would say, well, where does the morality come from? Because we get ours from God, right? And he wrote a book about it. So where did the Stoics come up with their morality?
From reason. So Stoicism, many people say,
hold on, but reason has changed. It was reasonable at one time to I'm going to think of something crazy here. Like you could reason. There's people that sleep with their animals, right? Like,
right.
Like literally have sex with their animals, and they have good reason for that in their mind. There's whole cultures of it sometimes. So where does it come from?
Well, I think one of the things the Stoics would say. So first of all, let's say let's come back to that in a second. But first of all, say, look, Stoicism resembles a religion in some ways. It's
of course
like a yoga or a Buddhism. It's a way of life. So in that sense, it's different from modern academic philosophy, or most modern academic philosophy, except that the Stoics say that they can derive morality from reason alone, basically, which is what your question, can we actually do that? Whereas religion typically says reason might help, but you also need revelation, scripture, tradition, and faith and stuff like that in order to derive morality. You need to get it from God. Now, first thing I think to get out of the way is the Stoics.
Look, and just to be clear, I argue back to them. Look, man, your sin, like, which is half of the religion here, came from a talking fucking snake. So, like, we're losing a little bit of reason here. I have never seen a talking snake. Yes. So, I mean, I agree here that neither are reasonable. But go ahead.
A lot of people don't believe in the talking snake these days. It's fair to say. That's true. And what you said about religions all teach, they have some common ground, but there are also many differences in the moralities that they teach. The interpretation of it changes over time. As many philosophers have said, scripture alone can't vouchsafe morality, because you usually need to make a decision about how you're going to interpret the scripture, and people disagree about that. So at the end of the day, you do end up having to fall back on your own individual resources. The Bible or any other religious scripture is not going to give you a definitive answer to all moral questions. It just can't do that. It's down to you to read it, interpret it, and figure out. And there may be different ways of doing that. So there's no escape from the responsibility that we have to use our own intellect, our own
cognitive reasoning, as you were talking about before.
Because the book's not ever going to be enough to do it for you, right? Whether it's the Bible or the Quran or the Dhammapada or whatever it is. So in a sense, I would say that, first of all morality has this problem of how do you derive the basic principles. It's not only a problem for Stoicism, but it's actually a similar problem for any world religion. God can't answer all the questions for you because he doesn't, he only gives you a kind of outline or a sketch. Now, what the Stoics would say is that their Stoicism is a virtue ethic. So the Stoics would say that their moral answers are quite broad, or if you like, kind of abstract in a sense. And then people may disagree about how to apply that morality in specific situations, right? So the Stoics would argue that reason alone could demonstrate to you that you should act with wisdom and justice and integrity and the virtues, basically. But different philosophers might disagree about whether it would be virtuous to give money to a beggar or not. And I think often people want moralities, want ethics to give them specific answers to questions like that. I've seen people say, would Stoicism tell me whether to give money to a beggar or not? And I would say it's impossible for any moral system to answer that question, because in order to arrive at a decision about it, it's not a question of pure morality. You need to know certain empirical facts, like certain facts that you might not be unaware of, and they might vary depending on the era that you live in and the country that you live in. So maybe you live in an area where people are starving because of a natural disaster, and you know if you give a beggar money, he's probably going to spend it on food, right? Or you might live in an area where if you give somebody money in the street, there's a pretty good chance they're just going to spend it on drugs or alcohol, right? It might not actually be doing them any good. But where
you can take that exercise further, right? Like they're going to spend it on drugs or alcohol. They're going to get into a car. They're going to go kill somebody else. Yeah. So should you have given money to that person? That's hard to know.
So an ethic can tell you what you should do is what helps the other person, perhaps, right? But it's not going to tell you whether you should actually give money to them or not, because there's a bunch of factual questions that no philosophical ethic could give you the answer to. You'd have to know the area. You'd have to know the type of people that you're dealing with. So you're going to need, and those are going to be judgments of probability as well. Right? So you're going to have to make judgment calls. So I think sometimes people expect too much of an ethic. They expect it to tell them exactly what to do in different situations. And I think the Stoics realized that all an ethical system can do is give you this kind of general guidance, like you should act with wisdom, you should act consistently, you should act with justice, like you should act with courage and self-discipline. But whether or not you actually do vote for a certain political party, or whether or not you help a certain individual, they say, well, there's a lot of other information you'd need to research first.
Yeah. Enough about Stoicism in and of itself, because
sorry, let me just I should interject one other thing. If people are kind of thirsty for a bit more of a justification, what I think the Stoics would say, this is me reconstructing their argument somewhat. This is a Socratic argument for a virtue ethic, right? So I think what Socrates and the Stoics would implicitly say is that human life is goal-directed, that because we can reasoning is goal-directed. Nobody reasons in order to get things wrong. Like we think and use reason because we want to, at some level, perceive and understand the truth. And so the Stoics think we're already implicitly, because we have self-awareness and reason, committed to trying to get to the truth of things, to trying to understand things. And so the Stoics, I think, and Socrates would conclude that given that we're already committed to thinking, we implicitly have an obligation to think properly, to think well, to think wisely. So if you're going to reason, your goal should be wisdom. Your goal should be to reason well about life and to do that pretty consistently. And so the Stoics therefore think that we have, like nature alone, like can confer on us this obligation to attain wisdom. And that if we exhibited wisdom in our relationships with other people, then we'd be exercising, and we did that consistently, we'd be exercising the virtue of justice. And that in order to do that, we'd have to be able to show wisdom and justice despite having fear and despite having cravings. And so we therefore also require the virtues of courage and self-discipline. So that's how they would derive the four cardinal virtues of Stoicism from the simple fact that we are reasoning beings.
Yeah. I 100% agree. So this podcast, it's not so much about the thing, right, that each individual does. I really like to tell the story of the individual on the podcast, because I think this is the most important story that there is to tell. Is you can do your thing that you are so passionate about and so purpose driven about, So how did you get into this? Where did this start? What was your road like? Because again, back to the purpose of the show here. If somebody else has a road that sounds like yours, they should listen. Be like, okay, this is what Donald did. The Stoicism almost doesn't even matter. Like, right? It's how you did your life to make this weird Stoicism thing happen for you.
Well, I can tell
Where
you
did it start?
how I got into Stoicism, and then
Yeah.
I think that some people might not care about that, and then other people might think, oh, like that kind of resonates with them.
Yeah, if one person hears the podcast and goes, oh, wait a minute, that's how I feel, then it's worth our time.
Sometimes that happens.
Yeah.
So when I was a young guy in Scotland, my father passed away, unfortunately, when I was quite young. I was about 13 or 14 years old when my father passed away. And I kind of,
God, that scares the shit out of me that I'm gonna die when my kids like that. That is a fear, But go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, that worries a lot of people.
Yeah.
So I kind of was looking for a direction in life, I guess. And I kind of got into trouble because I was not going to school and kind of playing cat and mouse with the local cops and things like that. And so I thought, I need to I don't have a father figure, right? I need to kind of like figure out what I'm supposed to do. And I realized quickly, like the more you kind of break the rules and fall between the gaps and live outside the system and stuff, it gives you a buzz because you have a kind of sense of freedom in some ways, but it also leaves you feeling kind of at sea because you kind of think, well, what's the point of any of this? Like, should I be trying to be rich and famous, or should I be trying to kind of have a good career, or I didn't have anyone to kind of point me in any particular direction. So I started reading books because my father was a Freemason in Scotland, which is a kind of relatively common thing, or it was when I was a kid in the part of Scotland where I grew up. Our national bard in Scotland, Robert Burns, is a master Freemason. And all my friends' fathers were Freemasons. So my father left behind all these books in Freemasonry, and I flipped through them, and I couldn't make much sense out of the symbolism. But there was a lot of references to Hebrew stuff, like King Solomon, and also a lot of references to Pythagoras and Plato and the cardinal virtues, and to Greek philosophy, Hellenistic culture, as I now know it to be. And so I started to read stuff about Kabbalah, about Christianity, all different world religions, kind of looking for some way of making sense out of it.
You want something to land on. You want like a home base for your life.
I wanted something to give me a kind of like a map, a kind of guidebook to life. I was like, okay, so like, I'm kind of an adolescent. I'm going to leave school pretty soon. Like, what am I supposed to be doing? Like, I didn't have anyone to kind of point me in the right direction. The teachers weren't really helping me much in that regard. Like, they just give me a kind of clip around the ear occasionally.
And they tell you how to do it for somebody else is what they tell you how to do it. They don't really tell you how to do it.
Yeah, they didn't tell me like what I should be doing. And the other future they painted seemed pretty kind of bleak. You could go and get a job in one of the local factories or something like that. And I thought, geez, that doesn't sound too thrilling, to be honest. So I got into reading books and stuff, and I read a lot of Christian stuff at first, and then that got me reading about Plato and Socrates and Greek philosophy. And then I went to university and I studied philosophy, and I kind of figured out pretty early on that I wanted to do something where I'd kind of be helping other people. So I got into training as a counselor and a psychotherapist. And then one day, after I graduated from university, I had a great time at university studying philosophy. I started studying counseling, psychotherapy, and I was studying meditation and self-hypnosis and reading lots of self-help books. And I felt like I was juggling three balls. There was the philosophy, the psychotherapy, and then the kind of spiritual self-help type stuff. And then after I left university, I just felt, wow, it's kind of a lot to take on. I'm reading, there's endless books and stuff, and I still don't really kind of have a sense of direction. I feel like one day all this is going to just come together for me, but so far it's not. I'm just more confused than I was to begin with. And then I kind of stumbled across the writings of a French academic called Pierre Hadot. And Hadot wrote about spiritual exercises that he found in ancient texts. And it became evident to me pretty quickly that the main school of ancient philosophy that had the most psychological or spiritual exercises was Stoicism. And Stoicism was the one major school of ancient philosophy that isn't normally covered in the undergraduate philosophy curriculum. So I'd studied Plato and Aristotle, but I'd never studied the Stoics at university. And to caricature it slightly, if you ask academic philosophers, they would say, or they did say to me, well, you know, if you said, why don't we study the Stoics? They would say, look, the Stoics just take ideas from like Aristotle and Socrates and Plato and guys like that, and then they kind of figure out the practical application of that in daily life. So like, why would anyone want to study that? They would say, why? Because they thought, well, we'll just study Plato or Aristotle, whatever. It's the concepts we're interested in, not the practical application. And I thought, but most normal people are more interested in the practical application of these ideas. You know, that's where it cashes in terms of something of practical
Well, that's
value.
where we get an ROI, right? That you get a return for your life.
Right. So I thought, but that's the bit I'm interested in. And so I started reading the Stoics. And, you know, I like to say, I don't like saying this, but I end up saying it a lot. I was into Stoicism before it was cool. It's kind of what I tried to avoid.
When did it get cool? Tell me when it got cool.
It got cool like round about 20 years ago, actually.
Okay.
It was a kind of gradual thing, like, but there weren't many popular books in Stoicism 25 years ago or so when I was beginning to read it. Bill Irvine's book, A Guide to the Good Life, I think had just come out, and then Ryan Holiday's books were beginning to come out. And people would say Stoicism, like that's this niche area. That
I was going to say Ryan Holiday made it cool for me. That's
Ryan Holiday, Tim Ferriss introduced some people to it as well, a lot of people. Then Gladiator came out, and a lot of people started reading Marcus Aurelius, because Richard Harris plays Marcus Aurelius at the beginning of Gladiator. And then a whole, now there's books in Stoicism that come out every week, it seems. And the internet is just awash with stuff about Stoicism and communities for Stoicism and stuff. But 20, 30 years ago, it was kind of like a no man's land, and you know, it was like a real obscure thing.
I understand, like that's like I do Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in America pre-2008 was like a no man's land. So yeah, I get what you're saying.
No one was interested. So I wrote a book about Stoicism because I thought it seems so obvious to me.
Sorry.
Sorry.
I'm sorry. I've never had that up 400 episodes.
I thought, like, Pierre Hadot says all this stuff about classics, but it seemed really, really obvious to me that the spiritual exercises, as he called them, and he listed loads of them, were similar to psychological exercises that we use in modern psychotherapy. And Hadot never mentions this once, as far as I saw, which really kind of surprised me, you know, when something seems so glaringly obvious. So I thought, why? Someone needs to just write a book. It's already, you know, it's like waiting to be written. That just says all these techniques are similar to ones that we use today, just kind of joins these dots. The book writes itself, kind of thing. And so I ended up writing a book about that. And I didn't think it would be a big deal because, you know, at that time, no one seemed interested in the subject. And I wrote the book for philosophers and psychotherapists. It was kind of published by a specialist publishing house called Cardinal in the UK. It published books on psychotherapy. And to my surprise, psychotherapists and philosophers didn't really read it, but the general public read it as a self-help book. And then I ended up
What's the name of the book?
It's called The Philosophy of Cognitive Behavioural Therapy. And that was the first book that I wrote in Stoicism. And since then, I've written about 6 or 7 other books on Stoicism on like philosophy and psychotherapy. I've probably written about 4 or 5 books on Stoicism. You know, now it's somewhere along the line, it just became like a big thing. One of the reasons for that was that there were people that were into Stoicism, but they didn't talk to each other because there was like a diaspora. They were all just kind of like spread out. You know, there wasn't a place you could go and hang out with other Stoics. Like, so with the internet, people started to form online communities. And they say, oh, you're into Marcus Aurelius, I'm into Marcus Aurelius too. And these communities got bigger and bigger because these people are just dispersed all over the world. Like, there are millions of them. Like, millions of people have read the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, but no one ever really thought of that they should all get together before the internet. The internet allowed them to get together, and then suddenly all over the world, like, they realized that it was a movement and there were communities pretty quickly, actually. So that's kind of how I got into it. And then I was invited by Christopher Gill, who's Professor Emeritus of Ancient Thought at Exeter University in England, to come down and attend a workshop with a bunch of other people that were writing books about Stoicism. And we formed, about 10 years ago, an organization, a non-profit called Modern Stoicism. And it runs an annual conference, and it's got a huge blog with hundreds and hundreds of articles on it. It runs online courses. And so Modern Stoicism got in all the newspapers in the UK and generated a lot of publicity, and it's still going. And that contributed to building the momentum in the community.
So here I am. I'm a guy. I'm listening to this podcast, or I'm Elliot over here sitting, listening to you. And my life's just kind of blah, right? Like, it's okay, right? I've got some depression, some underlying depression. Maybe that underlying depression causes me to have some anxiety, right? They're kind of cousins in a way, right? What do I do, Donald? What do I do?
Well, the first thing I would say to people as a clinician, I'm obligated to say that if people have severe anxiety and depression, the first thing they should do is go and get an assessment from a clinical psychologist or a CBT practitioner, because we know there are thousands of research studies on anxiety and depression. And contrary, I know people think psychotherapists are all a bunch of idiots, and that's only partly true, right? But there's a load of scientific research in this field, and we know a lot now about anxiety and depression and the treatments that are good for those problems. However, Stoicism can also be of benefit to people as a kind of adjunct.
Mm-hmm.
What Stoicism gives people that therapy doesn't is that therapy is time limited. CBT's normally time limited, with some exceptions. And so you go and have CBT and then it ends, and you're kind of like, what do I do now? But Stoicism is lifelong. It provides a whole philosophy of life, a whole way of life. So that's the bigger framework, if you like, that therapy can kind of fit into. What Stoicism can do.
Where do I start?
If you wanted to, if someone just wants to learn about it.
No, how do I start to fix my life?
Put it into practice.
Put it into practice. Like, not okay. I have a therapist, and like you just said, I have a therapist, and she's great, and I do actually have a therapist. I just saw her a couple hours ago. She's great. I love her. She helps me when we're on, and then I get off, right? Like the common story. Like, you go to your therapist, you dump all your bullshit, and then you pay them the money, and then you leave. Then you come back next week. Or I guess you don't leave anymore, right? It's all on Zoom, right? You come back next week and you dump all your bullshit from the week, right? But you're not really doing. There's no progress. How do I start to make some damn progress, man?
Well, first of all, like psychotherapy, it depends on the model that you're using, but cognitive behavioural therapy should be progress oriented, and should be monitoring outcomes and stuff like that. So that's as a kind of aside, like there are things that the therapist can be doing to help in that regard. But what you said is true, that people often compartmentalize therapy. So you go and do it, you switch off Zoom or whatever, and then it's over. Whereas Stoicism is something that you identify with, like a religion, or like being a Buddhist or something like that. It's all pervasive and it's lifelong. So what do Stoics actually do then? Well, they do a bunch of things. Like in that first book that I wrote, I listed 18 things that Stoics do, right?
Give me some.
So I'll give you some of them. I would say the main thing that the Stoics do is cognitive distancing, as we call it today. So that means the most famous quote from Stoicism is in the Enchiridion passage 5, where Epictetus says it's not things that upset us, but rather are our judgments or opinions about them. Now, understanding that statement.
Say it again. It's not things that
upset us, but rather our opinions about them. That's kind of the psychological core of Stoicism, but that is the cognitive model of emotion. And this sounds tricky at first. It's tricky for people to understand this, but grasping the significance of that sentence is one of the most powerful, and generally applicable things that you could do in order to help alleviate anxiety and depression. We call it cognitive distancing, or it's sometimes called verbal diffusion in therapy. It's the difference between noticing that you are having a thought and fusing that thought with external events. It's the difference between thinking life sucks and thinking right now I keep telling myself that life sucks. I wonder why I'm doing that. Like, so cognitive distancing is like you take a step back and observe your own thoughts, like from the side, like from a little bit of a distance.
Yeah.
And you see your thoughts as something that you're doing rather than just fusing them with reality. Aaron Beck, the founder of cognitive therapy, used to explain it to clients using this little metaphor. He'd say, imagine you were wearing rose-tinted glasses and you've been wearing them for such a long time, you've forgotten that they're on your face. So you just assume, like, Elliot's kind of pink, and that house is pink, and that dog over there is pink. Like, that's just what the world is like. The world's really pink, like, since COVID. You know, maybe it's got something to do with the pandemic.
Oof.
Like, and then
maybe that's a symptom of COVID, right?
Yeah, symptom of COVID. Someone comes and knocks the glasses off your face, and suddenly you think, oh, wow, I've just realized the pinkness is in the glasses. And I was like looking through it. So Elliot's not really that pink, and neither is the dog or the house, right? It's the glass that's pink. But I was confusing it with the things that I was looking at. Now, therapists would say that's what it's like when you say that something is awful or a catastrophe or terrible in many cases, that you act as if the external event itself is colored by your value judgment. And that leads you to forget that there's a kind of arbitrariness about it, that you're choosing to think about it. And that way, someone else might be looking at the world through blue lenses, and they might see it very differently. Not only that, but a year from now, you might have swapped out your pink lenses for blue ones. And so your future self might see the world as being completely blue, like, or green or whatever, right? And it's the same with the value judgments that you hold, like, and the opinions that you hold. Like, we tend to forget that this is an activity that we're engaged in. So therapists also illustrate that to clients by sometimes doing something we call verbification. So they'll get them to substitute verbs for adjectives or nouns. So rather than saying I'm depressed, you might say I'm depressing myself, like, and turn it into an activity that
it's a messed up thing that the English language does.
Yeah.
Right. I am depressed when, for example, like the Romance languages, right? Like I can speak a little Portuguese, or even good things like I'm happy. It's putting the adjective to the person, I am, where when you say it in other languages, I am with happiness. Yeah. And that's just a current state of being. It's not who you are.
The most common example in therapy today is that we get people to say, rather than saying this is a catastrophe, they'll say I'm catastrophizing it. So, like, I'm choosing to view it as a catastrophe. Someone else might view it as an opportunity, or they might view it as bad but not catastrophic, like, or they might view it with indifference. And like I said, my future self a year from now might view the same event as not catastrophic anymore. That's often how the way things work out. So first thing is the Stoics would teach us to be constantly mindful. Stoicism is a kind of mindfulness. They even have a word for it. The Stoics call it prose. That means paying attention, right? Weirdly, this is a little bit of trivia for you. They still use that word in modern day Greece, right? So if you visit Greece, you'll see warning signs. Like, we would have a sign that says beware of the dog. They would say prosochi skilos. Like, so it means pay attention, watch out. That's the word that the ancient Greeks used for mindfulness, that we should pay attention to our own value judgments continually and notice when we're viewing something as awful or catastrophic, or as if it's a life and death matter, that we're choosing to impose those values on external events. So that's something we should train ourselves to do throughout the day, the Stoics thought. And another thing that they thought we should do.
How do you do that?
How do we do that?
So how do you take that? Like, you're talking about, like, distancing yourself from your thoughts, for example. Dude, my friends, or my former friends right now, they have done so much to me. You know, they have done all of these things to me, and, like, I'm so mad at them, and I can just start listing you these things that they've done. How do I distance myself from the thought?
Well, in order to gain cognitive distance, right, I could probably rattle off half a dozen different ways of doing it, right? They don't all come from Stoicism.
Right.
There are several that we find in the Stoics. So one would be the statement that I mentioned earlier, just really contemplating that and reminding yourself of that. It's not things that upset us, but rather our opinions about them. Another one would be talking to the thought. So Epictetus tells his students, when you have a troubling impression, like when you're pissed off about something, say to yourself, you're just an impression and not at all the thing that you claim to represent. So you'd say, like, you know, this is a thought that I'm having. Like, and you maybe even talk to it. Like clients do this today in therapy, where they'll say, "Hello, depression. Haven't seen you for a while," like as if they're talking to another person. It seems a bit weird, right? But it allows them to create this. And I would say a lot of people at first don't quite understand what cognitive distancing means.
It's very hard. Yes,
it's a little bit of an abstract concept, but once you get it, it's really simple. And there's a ton of research that shows how effective it is. So it's just a way of shifting perspective so that you're looking at your thoughts rather than looking at the world through them. Another way that's very popular today is
I like what you said there, so that you're looking at your thought and not looking at the world through them.
Yeah, like taking your colored glasses off and looking at them rather than looking through them all the time. So you might say to yourself, you might prefix a negative thought by saying, "I notice right now that I'm thinking." So rather than going, "Nobody likes me, everybody hates me, I think I'll go and eat worms," you might say to yourself, "I notice right now that Donald is telling himself, nobody likes me, everybody hates me." And by slowing it down and prefacing it with a statement that kind of puts it in quotation marks, "I notice right now that Donald," and putting it in the third person, that forces me to adopt this kind of sideways perspective on it, to view it from a more objective point of view. That's cognitive distancing. Another way of doing it that seems really weird at first, but works like very robustly. We know this works about 90% of times in laboratory experiments where people have done this. A psychologist called Titchener discovered at the beginning of the 20th century that if people repeat a word very quickly and we now know the optimum time to do this is 45 seconds. Like, so if you repeat a word really quickly, after a while, it starts to kind of feel meaningless, or it kind of feels strange. So if, say, you took "nobody likes me, everybody hates me," the client would say, "Nobody likes me, everybody hates me, nobody 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 likes me, everybody hates me." Now, that was only like 5 or 10 seconds, right? And already it starts to feel awkward.
You're like, "Shut up, man."
Yeah, shut up. It's kind of getting annoying. Imagine doing it for 45 seconds. It seems like ages.
Right.
And by the end of it, when you then repeat that sentence to yourself, it feels again like you've wrenched yourself into this kind of external perspective to it. It kind of feels like I could have that thought, but it feels like it's kind of, I could pick it up or put it down. I'm at a slight distance to it now.
I can see that because like what we do a lot, right, is I go, "Nobody likes me, everybody hates me," and then I tell a story about it. And when I tell the story about it, then 10 minutes later I'll be back at "nobody likes me, everybody hates me," and then I'll tell the story.
That's how it gets claws into you, buddy. Like, so for sure, that's kind of similar to the problem that we call rumination or perseverative thinking in psychology. So the more you kind of think about a negative thought and analyze it and tell a story about it, it's like it's creating a web around you when it does that, and you get more and more entangled with it, right?
It's like an OCD.
Yeah, and even if you think you're kind of getting it out of your system, or you're trying to solve the problem, often you're just getting more and more entangled in this more and more elaborate net that you're creating by doing that. That's how it works. People didn't see it like that before. So Sigmund Freud, like early psychotherapists like Sigmund Freud and Jung and these guys, if you went and said, "Listen, I'm having panic attacks and stuff," they'd say, "Go and lie on that couch, for 5 hours a week and, stare at the ceiling and tell me about your mother and stuff," right? Now we know that may have helped some people, but many people would probably get worse by doing that. Like doing that might actually make depression worse, because it encourages a style of thinking that we psychologists call ruminative thinking, where you go round and round in circles and elaborate on the thoughts that are.
Have you ever met my Jewish mother?
Is that what she's like? Is she like an expert on that?
My whole family is like this.
Yeah, we're all experts. It's part of the culture almost today. It's, we live in quite a verbal, I think with social media and things, it kind of maybe encourages it a little bit as well. But we have to be able to kind of, worry and rumination are like a horror story that you tell yourself, right? And you have to be able to kind of snap out of it, like, and notice that you're telling the story and how long you've been telling yourself the story, so that you can kind of like stop telling yourself the story, rather than becoming a character in the story and getting entangled with it all. It's hard to do. Like, we get sucked into it. Like, but weird techniques like the word repetition and stuff like that can help people to do it. Also, what the early cognitive therapists would do would be just get people to write their thoughts down and then put it on a flip chart on the other side of the room and take a few steps back and look at the thought from a distance and evaluate it as if they were looking at a thought that someone else had, to get this kind of objectivity towards your own thinking rather than getting too entangled with it.
A couple questions here as we end. Why are you doing this? Why are we on this podcast? Like what's in it for you? Because I use the same example all the time. Like we talked about Tim Ferriss earlier. I'm not Tim Ferriss, man. Maybe you're gonna sell one book. Maybe.
Yeah, probably make like 25 cents out of that.
Yeah. So I've got a quarter.
Buy a coffee or something. Yeah. Maybe.
Right. So why do you do this? Like, come on some obscure guy's podcast that you've never heard of that,
because going on a podcast is a good way to reach new audiences and a wider audience. Like when I worked with clients in therapy, I thought it was really cool that I could see the concrete results right in front of me. But then when I started writing books and doing podcasts and stuff, I thought, well, now I'm reaching like hundreds of thousands of people, like altogether, like rather than just like a few dozen people or whatever. So it means that you're reaching far more people. And also I like talking about Stoicism. It's kind of a hobby, and talking about it allows me to deepen my understanding of it. I benefit from doing it. And in terms of writing books, I find answering people's questions allows me to be better at writing my books. It's kind of, if I now go away and write about Stoicism, I'll think, well, the stuff that you could relate to and the stuff that you asked me about is maybe stuff that would be worth dwelling on in more detail in the next book or article that I write.
Last question. I believe everyone has a unique power that they give to the world. Something that makes them amazing, not necessarily rich and famous like we talked about. What's your power? What's your superpower?
What's your superpower? Wow, that's an interesting thing. I'm going to say something quite unusual, I think. I don't know if it's unique. You asked me earlier what it was that put me on the path that I'm on in life. And I think partly it was my father passing away. And then also partly I think it was like I had a few brushes with death, which is pretty common. I think it's actually surprising when people say they've never had a brush with death. Like, because by the time you're middle age, maybe you've had some health scares, maybe you've been in a few near misses or dangerous situations. And, if you're
what kind of fucking life did you live if you don't have a brush with death by the time you hit 40?
I reckon when I've asked audiences, it's usually I think about 2/3 of people that say they've had a brush with death by the time they're middle, and about a third of them don't seem to have, unless they maybe just did and forgot about it.
Yeah.
But the things that have changed me the most, and I think of as a kind of superpower, are the brushes with death that I've had, because I think most people walk around in a trance. And they're hypnotized by celebrity culture, consumerism, social media, hedonism, egotism, like all the superficial crap that makes up society. Like we're thrown out into the world, and before we get a chance to think critically, we're already sucked into the prevailing values of our decadent society. Like we get bombarded with it from all quarters. And one of the few things that can snap us out of the trance is a brush with death. And then we think, like, geez, I thought I was going to die there. Like, and then you might think maybe watching all the episodes of Friends isn't actually that important. Or, maybe, winning an argument with some guy at work's not really that important. It puts things in perspective. Yeah, I think when you have a brush with death. And the Stoics knew that. And I think that's one of the things that can free us. Like, and also being bereaved, I think if you lose another person, it can also snap you out of the trance and make you think, what's the point of all this? Like, is it just to kind of do a 9 to 5 and pay your bills and buy a house and then die? Or is there more to life than that? Like, but what makes you special and what kind of liberates you and, makes you more than like you might have been in life is snapping out of that inertia and questioning the prevailing values of your society, I think.
That's good. Donald, tell everyone where they can reach you.
Well, that's really easy. You can just go to my website, which is donaldrobertson.name, Name, and I'm all over social media, and they can find my books on Amazon and whatnot. And
All
if they
right.
want to get in touch, they can get me that way.
Sounds great. Greatly appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much. Gentlemen, ladies, children, if you're listening, as always, don't go out in the world and try to be Donald. He has his unique thing that he does and gives to the world. Don't go out in the world and try to be me. I'm a crazy fucking idiot sometimes. So go out in the world, everyone, and find your own power.